There's a specific line that exists in every relationship with a narcissist, invisible until the exact moment you cross it, and understanding why it's invisible matters just as much as understanding what happens once you finally, unknowingly, step over it. This isn't the red line most people expect, the obvious one involving direct confrontation, open defiance, or public embarrassment. Those lines exist too, and they're relatively easy to spot, because the reaction they produce is loud, immediate, and unmistakable. The line we're exploring today is considerably quieter, considerably harder to detect in advance, and in many ways considerably more consequential once it's actually crossed. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it precisely because understanding this particular red line explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone who has experienced it. Moments where a relatively minor, seemingly unremarkable action triggered a response wildly disproportionate to anything you could have anticipated, leaving you genuinely confused about what actually happened, searching for an explanation that never quite makes sense given how small the triggering action actually seemed. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what this invisible line actually is, why it's structured to remain hidden until it's too late, and how to recognize its presence going forward before you find yourself standing on the wrong side of it again. Let's start with dismantling a common assumption, because it's the assumption that keeps this line invisible in the first place. The belief that a narcissist's reactions are proportional to the severity of whatever triggered them, that bigger transgressions produce bigger reactions, and smaller transgressions produce correspondingly smaller ones. This assumption feels intuitive, because it matches how most reasonable people expect consequence to actually work. But it doesn't hold up against what actually happens in these dynamics, and understanding why requires locating the real line, which has almost nothing to do with the objective severity of any particular action at all. Here's what the actual red line consists of, and it's worth stating precisely because it explains everything else this exploration will trace. The line isn't crossed by disagreement, disappointment, or even direct criticism, at least not primarily. It's crossed by anything that threatens the specific, carefully maintained narrative they've constructed about who they are, particularly in front of an audience whose perception matters to them. This distinction is worth understanding with real precision, because it explains why the same action, delivered in a private moment, might produce a mild, manageable reaction, while that exact same action, delivered in front of even a small audience, colleagues, family, mutual friends, can produce something considerably more severe, disproportionate to the point of genuine confusion. Let's talk about why this specific line remains invisible until it's actually crossed, because this is worth understanding as a structural feature rather than simply bad luck or poor timing on your part. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the narrative construction narcissists tend to build and maintain, often unconsciously, about their own significance, competence, and worth. This narrative operates continuously, in the background, shaping how they present themselves in every interaction, but its specific contours, exactly which details matter most, exactly which particular image is being most carefully protected, remain largely invisible to anyone outside their own internal experience, because the narrative itself was never actually communicated directly. It simply exists, privately maintained, until something happens to threaten it, at which point its presence and its importance suddenly becomes undeniable. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from an ordinary boundary, the kind most people can reasonably infer, or that gets communicated directly at some point during a relationship. An ordinary boundary, even an unstated one, tends to align with generally understood social expectations, respecting someone's space, not embarrassing them unnecessarily, honoring basic considerations most people intuitively navigate without much difficulty. The narcissist's red line doesn't operate according to these general expectations. It's specific to their own particular private narrative, which means it can be crossed by actions that would seem completely reasonable, even considerate, by any ordinary social standard, precisely because the line was never actually about ordinary social standards in the first place. Let's talk about a specific common scenario that illustrates this clearly. because it plays out with remarkable consistency across countless different relationships and contexts. Imagine offering a small, genuinely well-intentioned correction during a conversation with others present. Not delivered harshly, not intended to embarrass, simply a minor, factual clarification of the kind that happens constantly in ordinary social interaction without anyone thinking twice about it. In an ordinary relationship, this kind of small correction barely registers as significant at all. In a relationship where this particular red line exists, this same small correction can trigger a reaction entirely disproportionate to what actually happened. Coldness that persists for days. A sudden, seemingly unrelated argument that surfaces shortly afterward. A subtle but unmistakable shift in warmth that seems to have no obvious connection to the small correction that actually caused it. This disconnection between the objectively minor trigger and the considerably larger reaction it produces is worth understanding as the actual signature of this invisible line. And it's precisely what makes it so difficult to recognize in advance. Because the reaction so consistently seems disproportionate to whatever visibly happened, most people spend considerable time searching for some other explanation, wondering if something else entirely is actually wrong, wondering if they're somehow misreading the situation, rather than recognizing that the visible trigger and the actual underlying cause of the reaction were never actually the same thing at all. What we haven't yet explored is what specifically constitutes this narrative threat from the narcissist's internal perspective. Why certain seemingly minor actions threaten it so profoundly, while others, seemingly more significant by ordinary standards, don't threaten it at all, and how to actually begin recognizing this invisible line before you cross it, rather than only understanding its presence retroactively once the disproportionate reaction has already occurred. Let's talk about what specifically constitutes this narrative threat from the narcissist's internal perspective, because understanding the actual content of what's being protected is what makes this invisible line considerably more visible going forward. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific, carefully constructed self-image this psychology depends on: maintaining competence, superiority, being the most knowledgeable person in any given room, being the one whose judgment doesn't require correction or questioning. This image isn't monolithic. It tends to have specific, particular components, areas where the underlying insecurity runs especially deep, and these specific components, rather than the general category of criticism or disagreement, are what actually determine where this invisible line gets drawn. Here's what's worth understanding about why the same category of action can produce wildly different reactions depending on which specific component of the narrative it happens to touch. A correction about something entirely unrelated to their core self-image, a minor factual detail in an area they've never particularly invested their identity in, might genuinely produce little to no reaction at all. But a correction, even an equally minor one that happens to touch the exact area where their competence or superiority feels most precarious, most in need of ongoing protection, produces something entirely different, precisely because it's not actually the correction itself producing the reaction, but the correction's proximity to the specific fragile core this entire psychological structure exists to protect. This is worth understanding as genuinely useful, practical information, because it means this invisible line isn't actually random or impossible to map, even though it initially appears that way. It follows a specific, identifiable pattern once you know what to look for. It tends to cluster around whatever specific area of competence or identity this particular person has invested most heavily in projecting: professional expertise, parenting, intelligence, physical appearance, social status, whatever specific domain their sense of significance has become most tightly wound around. Correction, disagreement, or simply visible evidence of fallibility in this specific domain tends to trigger the disproportionate reaction we've traced throughout this exploration, while similar behavior in domains they haven't invested as heavily tends to pass without much notice at all. Let's talk about a second related component worth understanding, one that connects directly to something we discussed extensively in earlier explorations throughout this series: audience specificity. The fact that this invisible line often shifts depending on exactly who happens to be present when the potential threat occurs. This is worth understanding as considerably more granular than simply public versus private, because the actual determining factor tends to be whose perception specifically matters most to the particular narrative being protected. A correction delivered in front of people whose opinion genuinely matters to their self-image, colleagues in their specific professional field, family members whose approval carries particular weight, friends whose respect they're especially invested in maintaining, tends to trigger the line considerably more reliably than the exact same correction delivered in front of people whose opinion carries less weight within their particular narrative or in complete privacy, where no audience exists to witness the threat at all. This is worth understanding as genuinely useful for recognizing patterns in your own specific relationship, because it explains something that often confuses people trying to understand why the same behavior sometimes produces a severe reaction and sometimes doesn't, seemingly at random. The randomness isn't actually random. It's tracking, with real consistency, exactly which specific audience happened to be present, and exactly how much that particular audience's perception matters to the specific narrative currently being protected. Now let's talk about how to actually begin recognizing this invisible line before you cross it, because this is genuinely the most practical, useful information this entire exploration can offer. The first step involves deliberately mapping, as specifically as you can, exactly which domains this particular person seems most invested in projecting competence or superiority within. This mapping doesn't require guesswork. It's usually quite visible if you look for it directly, the topics they bring up unprompted with particular frequency, the areas where even mild, constructive feedback has historically produced outsized reactions, the specific achievements or qualities they reference repeatedly as central to their own identity and self-worth. Once this mapping is reasonably clear, the second step involves paying specific attention to audience whenever interaction touches on these mapped domains, recognizing that the same statement or action carries considerably different risk depending on who else happens to be present and how much that particular audience's perception matters within the specific narrative you've identified. This isn't about walking on eggshells indefinitely, and it's worth naming this distinction directly, because the goal here isn't permanent, anxious vigilance designed to avoid ever triggering any reaction at all. It's about accurate, specific understanding, which serves a different purpose entirely, helping you recognize in hindsight or in the moment exactly what actually happened when a disproportionate reaction occurs, rather than remaining confused, searching for explanations that don't actually exist, wondering what you did wrong when the answer was never really about wrongdoing in any ordinary sense at all. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what this understanding actually means for how you move forward, whether this understanding should change your own behavior going forward, and why recognizing this invisible line clearly, rather than continuing to search for explanations that assume ordinary proportional cause and effect, offers something considerably more valuable than simply avoiding future disproportionate reactions. Let's talk directly about what this understanding actually means for how you move forward, because this is where everything we've traced throughout this exploration needs to resolve into something genuinely useful rather than simply an interesting map of someone else's psychology. The first and most important question worth addressing honestly: should this understanding actually change your own behavior going forward, deliberately avoiding the specific domains and specific audiences we've mapped throughout this exploration in order to prevent triggering these disproportionate reactions in the future? Here's the honest answer, and it's worth stating with real precision because it resists the simpler conclusion many people initially reach. Understanding this invisible line isn't actually an instruction to permanently, anxiously avoid it. That approach, tempting as it might seem, simply recreates the exact pattern we've traced throughout so much of this series: the gradual shrinking of your own honest expression in order to accommodate someone else's fragile, carefully protected narrative. If you find yourself deliberately withholding accurate, reasonable observations, deliberately avoiding entire topics, deliberately managing which audiences you're willing to speak honestly in front of, all in service of never triggering this particular line. You've simply built a more sophisticated, more informed version of exactly the accommodation this entire series has spent considerable time helping you recognize and release. This is worth understanding as the actual deeper value of everything we've traced throughout this exploration. The purpose was never to help you become more skilled at avoiding this invisible line indefinitely. It was to help you recognize clearly and accurately what actually happens when disproportionate reactions occur, so that you stop mistaking them for evidence of your own wrongdoing. Stop searching endlessly for an explanation rooted in ordinary proportional cause and effect that was never actually going to be found, because the reaction was never actually about ordinary proportionality in the first place. Here's what this recognition actually changes practically going forward. When a disproportionate reaction occurs, and it likely will, whether you're still in this relationship or navigating memories of a similar one, you now have accurate language for what's actually happening. This reaction is disproportionate not because you did something genuinely wrong, but because you unknowingly touched a specific fragile component of a carefully protected narrative in front of an audience whose perception happened to matter significantly to that narrative. This understanding doesn't obligate you to apologize more thoroughly, explain yourself more carefully, or work harder to avoid similar situations in the future. It simply, finally, allows you to correctly locate the actual source of the reaction in their own internal fragility, rather than in any genuine failing on your own part. Let's talk about the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. One that connects this specific invisible red line to something considerably larger this entire series has been building toward throughout its full length. The disproportionate reactions you've experienced, confusing and disorienting as they've likely been, were never actually random, and they were never actually about you in the way they felt like they were about you in the moment they occurred. They were reliable, predictable evidence of exactly the fragile core we've traced throughout so much of this series, revealed specifically in the moments when ordinary, minor actions happen to brush against exactly the areas this psychology has spent an entire lifetime working hardest to protect. This is worth understanding as genuinely liberating because it removes something that likely cost you considerable energy and considerable self-doubt throughout this relationship. The ongoing project of trying to identify what you'd done wrong, trying to construct an explanation that would make sense of a reaction that never actually made sense according to ordinary standards, because it was never actually operating according to ordinary standards in the first place. The reaction wasn't a mystery requiring your continued investigation. It was a map, revealing with remarkable consistency exactly where their own fragility lived. Information that was always more valuable for understanding them than for changing anything about your own behavior going forward. So if you've experienced this specific, confusing pattern, minor actions triggering disproportionate reactions you could never quite explain, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series. You were never actually crossing some reasonable, ordinary line that any careful, considerate person should have known to avoid. You were encountering the specific, particular contours of someone else's carefully protected fragility, revealed not through what you did wrong, but through what happened to brush against exactly the parts of them that were never actually stable enough to withstand ordinary correction, ordinary disagreement, or ordinary visibility in front of an audience whose opinion mattered too much to risk. That fragility was always theirs to carry. It was never something you needed to continue mapping, avoiding, or apologizing for. Once you finally understood, clearly and completely, that it was never actually about you at all. Let's go further into something worth naming directly, because it deserves genuine space rather than a brief mention, what it actually costs you, over time, to remain unconsciously vigilant about this invisible line without ever having named it clearly, because this cost is considerably higher than most people realize until they finally understand what they've actually been doing all along. Before this exploration gave you specific language for what's happening, you were likely still sensing this line, still adjusting around it, still developing an intuitive, unconscious wariness around certain topics and certain audiences without ever quite understanding why those particular combinations felt riskier than others. This unnamed vigilance is exhausting in a way that's difficult to fully articulate, precisely because it operates below conscious awareness, consuming genuine mental and emotional resources while never actually registering as effort you're consciously choosing to expend. Here's what's worth understanding about the difference between unconscious, unnamed vigilance and the accurate, specific understanding we've built throughout this exploration. Unnamed vigilance requires constant, ongoing calculation, a kind of perpetual background monitoring that never fully switches off, because without clear language for what you're actually watching for, everything remains potentially risky, requiring continuous assessment rather than allowing you to relax around the many, many situations that were never actually going to trigger this particular line in the first place. Named, specific understanding changes this considerably. Once you know precisely which domains matter, precisely which audiences increase risk, you can actually relax in every other context, freeing up considerable mental and emotional resources that were previously being spent on generalized, undifferentiated wariness that extended far beyond what was actually necessary. Let's talk about something else worth addressing honestly here, because it's a common experience worth naming directly. The specific grief that sometimes surfaces once this pattern becomes fully clear, a grief connected not to the relationship's difficulty in general, but to the specific realization of how much energy went toward protecting someone else's fragile narrative. Energy that could have been spent building your own life, your own confidence, your own genuine self-expression, rather than continuously, unconsciously calibrating around someone else's carefully hidden insecurities. This grief deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal, because it's genuinely painful to recognize, in hindsight, how much of your own natural, spontaneous expression got quietly filtered through this invisible mapping process. Years of holding back accurate observations, years of choosing words carefully around certain topics, years of unconsciously reading rooms for exactly the kind of audience risk we've traced throughout this exploration. Let's close with something important worth carrying forward from this specific edition, because it ties directly into everything this exploration has already established. Recognizing this invisible line clearly, understanding its actual mechanics rather than remaining confused by its unpredictable seeming effects, isn't just protective information about a particular relationship. It's also, in its own way, a kind of permission to finally stop the exhausting unconscious calibration that likely characterized so much of how you moved through that relationship. Permission to recognize that this vigilance, however necessary it once felt, was never actually a permanent requirement of how you're meant to exist in relationships generally.